What's going on? This is Theo Gremminger of Fantasy Points. I'm about to head out on vacation, little Disney World with the family, but don't worry, we're going to keep it going here. For today, we've got something very, very special for you. Ryan Heath just wrote a tremendous article that you can check out over at fantasypoints.com. He's going to be breaking it down with Scott Barrett. He's breaking down the biggest fantasy football takeaways from the 2025 season. It's a two-part series. The information for this is going to be crazy valuable as we take a look at what happened in 2025 and we get ready for the 2026 season. Enjoy, and we're going to continue to drop videos like this all off-season long right here on Fantasy Points YouTube.
That's him. That's the OG.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are listening to the School of Scott podcast. This is our first official podcast of the 2026 NFL season. We're recording after the Monday after Super Bowl Sunday, which I've always thought should be a national holiday. You have to go back to the cubicle hungover. I gave you the opportunity, Ryan. I said you could take the day off. We could record this on a Tuesday, but Ryan Heath, trooper that he is, we're here. We're going to be recording, I think, 2 episodes back to back. One is a macro look back at the 2025 season, all lessons learned. This is a weird year. This is a unique year. What can we learn from the changes that we saw in 2025, and then follow that up with another podcast, a micro look, which I know everyone's looking forward to. Who were my Exodia plays? What did I get right? What did I get wrong? What lessons can we learn from that? Some really bad calls. Kenneth Walker, I know you're still very upset about that. And some really good calls. You know, the Exodia quarterback did it again. And so we'll get into that. But first, Ryan Heath, what are your thoughts on this Super Bowl as an NFL analyst and as a Patriots fan?
I mean, I'll give the Patriots fan thoughts first. My thoughts there are I started drinking a lot more heavily as we got into the third quarter. It became a lot less fun as a Patriots fan very, very rapidly. Yeah, I don't know. I'll rant about this on Dynasty Points more probably, so people can check that out if they're interested in all the cope. But I don't know. I'm just seeing all of like Drake Maye's future is so bright. This Patriots team has so many good things ahead of them. It's like we said the exact same thing about Joe Burrow 4 years ago, and he never got back. Like it's really freaking hard to get to this stage in the NFL. So yeah, I'm always like the pessimistic Patriots fan, which I know some people find insufferable, but that's I have every reason to be pessimistic. Unfortunately, they were all validated last night. But yeah, no, I mean, just as a NFL fan, really kind of interesting, like sea change in the NFL. I feel like for so long, we just talked so much about how these like unicorn quarterbacks are like all that matter in the league, and you're screwed if you don't have like one of 5 guys. And yeah, Seattle really just put on a total clinic of if you build an amazing roster from top to bottom, and especially an amazing defense like that can carry you very far. Darnold played not that great, but we got the Ken Walker bell cow usage that we've been getting throughout the playoffs. That has also been personally frustrating / enjoyable in some ways. So yeah, just so much with the Super Bowl. Could honestly do a whole podcast just on that, but that's not what we're here to do today.
Yeah, just to give my thoughts on it, my friends kept asking me who I thought would win. And I basically was like, feels like there's an 80% chance that the Seahawks win by 10 to 13 points. And then like a 20% chance Sam Darnold just inexplicably shits his pants, and he didn't do that. And yeah, it was just very clear that this Seahawks team was so much better than this Patriots team. And yeah, it was a weird year. So like, I mean, we could segue now into your realizations. You wrote a great article on this. It's very long, but you got the nice little TLDR section at the top. If you just want the quick hits, if you want to dig really deep into the minutia, we have that as well. And, you know, that's largely what we're doing on today's podcast. But I mean, one of my, you know, big takeaways is maybe like, let's not like overreact to just a weird 1 year sample size. Cause it was a very weird year. You know, it wasn't, you know, the Chiefs didn't even make the playoffs. And like, who were the dominant teams this year by wins and losses? It was a lot of teams we didn't see coming. We didn't see the Patriots being, beating out the Bills to be atop the AFC East. The Jaguars, being a 13-4 team. Even in the NFC, the Bears as well, you know, one of the best teams, the Seahawks too. Like you said, you had a great team top to bottom. Their offensive line kind of sucks on paper. And, you know, like, I know you're a pessimistic Patriots fan, but yeah, I mean, where did Vegas have the Patriots coming into the year? But they're not losing anyone. It's hard to get back, but they're not losing anyone. They have a ton of salary cap room, but Seahawks are losing Clint Kubiak, who, you know, you and I both think is a genius. And so, yeah, I think one of my lessons learned was, you know, something we've harped on continually is just how crucially important an offensive play caller is from a fantasy perspective and an NFL perspective. And so I know you're going to get into the McShanahan tree. I'll just say, yeah, it was like a weird year where like there wasn't any really dominant team, you know, I guess it was the Seahawks, right? But like the Eagles, as dominant as they looked last year, they were an 11-6 team. The 49ers didn't have a defense, couldn't stay healthy. The Rams, you know, didn't really have a great defense. And then, yeah, AFC, it was just, you know, wide open. And the best team was, you know, apparently the Patriots, in part because Denver lost their quarterback. And yeah, it just looked like, you know, really couldn't hold a candle to this Seahawks team. But yeah, I don't know. You could take this and you can pick this up from wherever you want, Ryan, and dive into your article.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's dive into the article. So as people know, if you've been reading me or reading Scott or listening to us for any length of time, a lens that we always like to use is league-winning players, right? And when we say a league winner, a league-winning player, we very specifically mean based on data that ESPN puts out every single season, players that are on a playoff roster in over 55% of ESPN leagues. So yeah, they're driving their teams to make the fantasy playoffs at an overwhelmingly high rate. We like this because it doesn't just overweight like the last few weeks of the fantasy playoffs, which can be inherently more random, smaller sample size. It takes a good chunk of the season, and it's actual data in terms of which players are getting teams into the fantasy playoffs, giving you a chance. There were a lot of league winners this year. There are some seasons where you only get like 9 or 10. We had close to 18, 20 this year. So a lot of them, while it was a weird year in the NFL, not that weird of a year in terms of league winners and who they were. We have a lot of the running backs kind of from the first couple rounds, and their names you might expect. It's Jonathan Taylor up at the top. 72% of teams with Jonathan Taylor made the fantasy playoffs. Christian McCaffrey right behind him, also at 72%. Devon Achane, Jahmyr Gibbs, Bijan Robinson, James Cook kind of getting in there as well from the fourth round of most ESPN leagues. So those are kind of your top end running backs. Rico Dowdle, interestingly, as an undrafted free agent, makes it in there. Been a while since we've had like a true league-winning running back off the waiver wire, but Dowdle did just especially in the middle of the season, just kind of outright win you like 4 or 5 weeks when he was being used as the Dave Canales bell cow there. So yeah, big kind of league winning pick there. Got a lot of teams into the playoffs, clearly. That was it at running back. Notably, more running backs than wide receivers for the second year in a row. 7th time over the past 9 years that we've had more league-winning running backs than league-winning wide receivers in total. I know for like a year or so, a little while there, I was flirting with the idea of, well, maybe wide receivers are just the better early round picks. I've said like some version of that, at least at a couple different points in the last couple years. I don't believe that anymore. I think we have enough of a sample now, 9-year sample, most of them, it's running backs that make up at least the plurality, if not the majority of league-winning picks. I think like your default in the early rounds should be you draft a running back, if not multiple running backs. I think robust RB is totally viable. We'll talk about wide receivers. There's honestly a lot more happening at that position that's interesting, but yeah, just wanted to update people there that's just kind of an approach shift I'm going to be having that this year confirmed, but also like in the whole context of all the data we have over the last decade. That's just kind of where I'm at now. It's like a little bit harder to argue that overall you're better picking wide receivers early. That said, we did have some nice league winners at the wide receiver position. Jaxon Smith-Njigba up at 71%, third most common player on ESPN playoff rosters. After that, you've got Puka Nacua at 60%, George Pickens, Devontae Adams just behind him, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Rashee Rice actually kind of just sneaking in over our 55% line. So there were early round wide receivers that you could draft that did turn into league winners. We were very big on Puka Nacua. Shout out Chris Wecht, projections god, took a lot of crap for that at a lot of different points last offseason, was proven very correct. Puka Nacua, an amazing pick at the end of the first round. But yeah, so you've got your wide receivers, but again, just like most seasons recently, it's been more running backs, especially early. That's kind of like the overall lay of the land. Other league winners to throw in, mention Trey McBride, 63% of playoff rosters. We'll talk about him quite a bit later on in the podcast. He and Tyler Warren were the only 2 tight ends, Warren barely making it. And at quarterback, we had Josh Allen, 58%, not too surprising. And Patrick Mahomes at 57%. And again, remember, this is just for getting you into the playoffs. Mahomes obviously went down right before the fantasy playoffs started. So got a lot of teams there. Obviously, him and Rashee Rice did not help you after that. So yeah, that's just a quick overview of who the league winners are, who we're talking about. Anything that you want to kind of add on to that, Scott, before we move on to some of the kind of bigger takeaways and like more in-depth advice that I'm taking from this season?
Yeah, this is the best methodology we have. We're using your win rate, your chances of making the playoffs with this player on your roster according to ESPN's data. It's not perfect like this. Jonathan Taylor was tied with CMC as the best, but he obviously didn't do anything throughout the playoffs. CMC was much better. Like you said, Patrick Mahomes got hurt, right? So if we had access to both, for every single player, their championship win rate and their playoff win rate, we could do something where it's like double weighting for playoffs and just a single weighting for the championship. But we don't have it. We don't have the complete data set, so we can't do that. But this is, just about the next best thing. And, as we've talked about before, it's, making the playoffs is very much more a function of skill than winning the championship. Unless you have a true juggernaut team, it's really, you need to get lucky to win those 3 games in a row. So that's why we do this. It's not a perfect methodology, but it is, I really think, the best one. I think it's better than Fantasy War even. certainly much better than VORP. And so just looking at this chart, which you can find reading Ryan's article, what clearly stands out to me is the running backs. Look at players with a win rate over 60%, and you see 6 running backs, you see 1 wide receiver, you see 1 tight end, you see 0 quarterbacks. Really, goes back to what we've been preaching for quite a long time. That's where the highest scoring running back in any given fantasy season is probably going to be the most important, most valuable asset in fantasy football. And so it's not just that, but it's also looking at where these running backs were drafted. Jonathan Taylor, CMC, Devon Achane, Jahmyr Gibbs, Bijan Robinson. Those are the top 5 most important, most valuable running backs. They're all rounds 1 and 2. And so you see JSN way up there, round 4 ADP. You see Puka Nacua all the way down below the James Cook, the Rico Dowdle, really just slightly above George Pickens. And you think back on what Puka Nacua did, and I know he missed a few games, like that seems surprising, but maybe not when you remember he was going late round 1, early round 2. So in order to take him, you would have had to pass on a Jonathan Taylor or a Devon Achane. And so, to me, this really just once again speaks to the importance of getting the running back position right. And like that is more than anything else, what's going to decide whether or not you win the championship is who were the running backs you took in the first 3 rounds of your draft.
Yeah, 100%. So I have the most to say about wide receivers. So this will be, we'll come back to running backs. And I do think there's some really interesting takeaways from running backs from this last year. But just because wide receivers are kind of the topic that's in vogue right now with all of the personnel changes and the shifts in the NFL, let's hit them first. I think it'll be the most extensive conversation. Then we can get to maybe like a new cheat code that I am going to be floating for drafting running backs. So to kind of set the lay of the land at wide receiver for 2025, the top end of the position was still really great. If you just look at VORP, value over replacement, the top 3 wide receivers, which were Jaxon Smith-Njigba, Puka Nacua, Jamar Chase, just by fantasy points per game, they had the most VORP compared to the bottom 3 starters at wide receiver of any single season since 2014. And so you might say, oh, great, like the top end wide receivers, maybe I do want them. And you do. But really the reason behind that is that the bottom end of the wide receiver position, or really the whole range of fantasy wide receiver 2s, was way worse than anything we've ever seen in recent history. Just if you look at the wide receiver 10 by fantasy points per game, then the wide receiver 11, all the way down to the wide receiver 20. So the next 10 guys after the top 10, all of them averaged about 2 fewer fantasy points per game than we see in a typical season. This visual is in my article with all the conditional formatting, but you can just see the whole kind of bottom half of the wide receiver position. It's all bright red compared to every other year. There was just so much less depth at the receiver position in 2025. A lot of people around the industry have done some really good kind of behind the scenes work on that, like under the hood. Why is this happening? Shout outs to Ben Gretsch, JJ Zacharyson, and our own Chris Wecht, who all have some very interesting data writing out there on the topic. But to give kind of the cliff notes for why, it's a lot of teams are playing a lot fewer 3 wide receiver sets. So for a while in the NFL, 11 personnel, which is 3 receivers on the field, was just very efficient. Dropping back in 11 personnel was always the best thing you could do against what defenses were showing offenses. That is no longer true at all. So a lot of offenses have kind of responded by playing a lot more heavy personnel, which means 2 or fewer wide receivers on the field. There were fewer overall pass plays and passing yards this season and over the past couple of seasons. That has been a trend. And this year specifically with the new kickoff rules, that exacerbated the decrease in passing yards, pass attempts even more. It did increase scoring overall, more touchdowns being scored, but it mostly went to running backs and to tight ends. Chris had some awesome data out there. I linked to it in the article that people can check out on that. So what we're getting is just fewer receivers on the field, or they're on the field less, and offenses, even if they're not explicitly designed more around RBs and tight ends, at least this past year, it happened that running backs and tight ends were scoring a lot more of the touchdowns becoming more and more important relative to yards in terms of overall fantasy points with all the NFL rule changes. So you just have fewer wide receivers than usual putting up really good fantasy scores. So I'll throw it back to you first, Scott, before I get into like what I think we should do in fantasy football to respond to this. Just if there's anything you want to say on kind of the overall wide receiver landscape in the NFL.
So, obviously like our biggest miss, we'll get to this when we talk about it in the micro pod. It was not going all in on JSN, not having more JSN. You and I both were just like, listen, either Kenneth Walker or JSN is going to go nuclear. And we were both like, it's Kenneth Walker.
Yep.
And obviously it was JSN, but I mean, we had adapted very quickly. It was like week one, JSN had, 128 yards, 134 yards, something like that. And you and I were both like, this is now a top 3 fantasy wide receiver immediately. And then we doubled down week 2. He had another 100-yard game. And we're like, it is the world revolves around 2 wide receivers. It's Puka and it's mini Puka, which is what we call JSN, although obviously JSN had the bigger year. And the reason for that was because we looked at his target competition. It was like minimal 11 personnel. It was mostly just him and another wide receiver, Cooper Kupp or whoever else in rotation, some 13 personnel sets. And so basically and also like the alignment, the horizontal route tree, and all this, it was just pointing to lesser target competition, because if you're competing for targets against tight ends and running backs, you're more likely to get the ball than against 2 other wide receivers on the field at the same time. So it's a higher expected target per route run. And so I'll just say, like, we adopted to that pretty quickly. But yeah, this really seems to be, one of the biggest changes of the 2025 season. For the longest time, we lived in this pass heavy, 11 personnel heavy world. And that's changed. And when, there's less wide receivers on the field, more likely for the dominant wide receiver one to get the ball. And we certainly saw that play out.
Yeah, so that I'm glad you brought that up, because that's kind of part one of how I want to respond to this like NFL meta change in fantasy football when it comes to drafting wide receivers. So I ran the numbers on this actually before this past season. This was a trend that I had pointed out in the like coaching review article where we went over all the new offensive play callers. It is just a cheat code if you are the wide receiver that's still on the field when your team is in heavy personnel. You're competing with fewer wide receivers. You're now competing with another tight end or another running back that's on the field for targets. Much easier to draw a target, much easier to score fantasy points if you're the lucky wide receiver that's still on the field for that play. The difference between a 3 wide receiver set and a less than 3 wide receiver set is a 32% increase in your fantasy points per route run for a wide receiver. So because of that, when we're surveying the league next year, when we're looking at wide receivers to draft, we need to be like very aware of, is this going to be a heavy personnel team or is this going to be like a spread 11 personnel team? And if it's a heavy personnel team, we want to pay special attention to their wide receiver one, to the guy that is going to be on the field for all of these like heavier personnel dropbacks. if you just look at the list of the most targets per game out of heavy personnel, and I have this in the article, but the top 7 are Zay Flowers, who had the most random wide receiver 1 by fantasy points per game season ever. I say random, I really mean sneaky. He was the wide receiver 12 by fantasy points per game, 14.5, which is shocking, especially including like the Lamar Jackson injury and all of that. Flowers was, while again, it was a down year overall for wide receivers, that's like pretty impressive in terms of a run heavy team, hurt quarterback. Zay Flowers did that much. It's because he gets so much of an advantage from being on the field so much in those heavy sets. DK Metcalf is next, who I've hated on all season, but like adjusted for an Arthur Smith offense, he had a pretty solid year. Only the second ever wide receiver to go over 12 fantasy points per game under Arthur Smith. AJ Brown being the first. Even Drake London couldn't do that. And then after that, you have Drake London, Jaxon Smith-Njigba, obviously both elite producers, with London at least when Michael Penix was healthy. JSN speaks for himself. The heavy personnel clearly benefited him. Then Jamar Chase speaks for himself. Jalen Waddle, who, what's interesting here is that once Waddle became the guy who was always on the field for 90+% of the heavy personnel routes, he became a really efficient wide receiver. He was the wide receiver 3 by yards per route run after the Tyreek Hill injury. Went up to nearly 15 fantasy points per game if you exclude the one bad weather game and 3 Quinn Ewers starts. Waddle was sneaky very good, despite all of the issues with Tua Tagovailoa this year. And yeah, he was benefiting from heavy personnel. And then the biggest one is probably Michael Wilson. We were all so shocked that Michael Wilson just comes in anytime Marvin Harrison Jr. is inactive and he looks like Marvin Harrison Sr. Arizona was one of the biggest heavy personnel teams in the league. Wilson, when Harrison is out, is the one that's on the field for all of these heavier personnel sets. So, of course, these targets are going to more naturally funnel to him. He was 26 fantasy points per game with Marvin Harrison Jr. inactive. I think that's the heavy personnel thing is under discussed in terms of the Michael Wilson mystery of 2025. So yeah, looking forward, maybe we will just do a separate article on this, but I just want to go team by team, looking ahead to 2026 and say, these are the ones that are going to be in heavy personnel. These are the ones, therefore, that we need to target the wide receiver 1 and ignore all the other guys. You can't be drafting the Josh Downs types of wide receivers on these teams because they're just not going to be on the field.
Yeah, so I think that article is definitely a must. Just if we could, pre-hindsight identify this year's JSN, if there is one, it's worth spending a great deal of time doing that. And then even if not, just for best ball, there's always value in, a free wide receiver 3 on an 11 personnel heavy offense. You could take in the last round of the draft and he's going to have, 3 spike weeks. And that's, that returns, positive value to your team. But as we're going through this, it's also or maybe this is just an article to do on top of your play caller piece, which is going to be so important. It was so important this year. You're talking about how, DK Metcalf had this amazing year for an Arthur Smith wide receiver, but he was awful. So it's just avoid Arthur Smith wide receivers. Clint Kubiak, meanwhile, is, clearly a genius. And is Brock Bowers going to go nuclear? Is Ash and Jeanty going to have a resurgence? So yeah, again, I think this really just speaks to the importance of identifying sharp play callers and then what kind of system they run and how beneficial is that for fantasy.
Yeah, so that's kind of my first that's the encapsulation of like my first takeaway for how we should be pivoting at wide receiver, how we should think of the position going forward. I do think that at least some of those points are going to like seep their way into the market, will become more popular this year. The industry gets sharper every single season, et cetera, et cetera. But I do also kind of have a way to zag when others are zigging in this sense, maybe. Because I think it might get lost that there are still teams that are living in 11 personnel. It's fewer teams than it used to be, but there are teams that have the wide receiver talent where that makes sense to do, that have the quarterbacks that can kind of make that happen on their own. They don't necessarily need heavy personnel and like an elite run game to generate offense. Like there's a few of those guys in the league. And I do think that the wide receiver in real life, like on a team, has been criminally underrated in fantasy football for years. On these teams, on these elite offenses that can support multiple great receivers. And I kind of had this broken down by like league winning percentage in the article that people can check out using like a somewhat complicated like ADP formula. All that's explained in the article, but long story short, the team wide receiver twos on these elite offenses, so think like the George Pickenses or Devontae Adams from this year, T. Higgins in a lot of past seasons, there are still offenses that are like that every single year. We, as like the fantasy football public, are pretty good at identifying what those offenses are, which I know because those team wide receiver twos hit at such an outstanding rate compared to team wide receiver ones, like at every band of average draft position. So I do think that aside from like drafting the wide receiver ones on the heavy personnel teams, we should also really make it a point to double down on, CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens. We were calling them this year's Bengals or whatever for a lot of the season. We want next year's Cowboys, and it probably / maybe is the Cowboys, assuming George Pickens is going to re-sign, right? So just like looking for those situations where it's very obvious that two wide receivers are going to produce, that the teams are going to be pass heavy, live in 11 personnel, just like doubling down on drafting the wide receiver two on those teams. Because again, they're always criminally underrated. People always get very obsessed with it. Like, I think kind of like the casual fantasy player gets very obsessed with, oh, that guy's not even the wide receiver one on his own team, just from like a base level of like, I want to draft the best players. I want to draft the team wide receiver one. So specifically for those teams that look like that schematically, I want to double down on the wide receiver too.
Yeah, I just think, it's not like the running back position where, you're competing against another running back for touches. There's only a limited number of snaps, of carries, of targets to go around. And so the more work Zach Charbonnet gets, the worse Kenneth Walker is going to be. But that really doesn't work out the same way as it does with wide receivers. Like Walker and Charbonnet are massively negatively correlated together, but Jamar Chase and T. Higgins are massively positively correlated together. Like it's a 0.20 positive correlation. And I think that makes sense. Is like the more Jamar Chase is getting open, the better off T. Higgins is going to be. Or if, Joe Burrow's really dealing, they can both easily go off. And so there's going to be so many think pieces this year of, is CeeDee Lamb the Cowboys wide receiver to draft? Is George Pickens the wide receiver to draft? And it's just, no, they're both great. Like, it's kind of stupid to think of it that way. Drafting them both on the same team, I kind of, you run into a little bit more risk and, volatility where, if Dak Prescott were to suffer an injury, it's a larger negative impact to your team. But outside of that, like, as long as the value's there, I don't mind it. If you're in a tournament style league like FFPC's main event or underdog, then it makes sense to grab both of them because they are positively correlated together. But yeah, I think that's right. I think you lose the point sometimes when it's, you know, CeeDee Lamb or George Pickens, but yeah, and that just leads to wide receiver 2 as being undervalued. Like, you know, T. Higgins was a player I really liked this past year and the year before that, because he's overshadowed by Jamar Chase, but he's still like a tremendously valuable fantasy asset in his own right.
Yeah. I think that kind of sums up everything in terms of the wide receiver meta change, what I want to do going forward. Again, if you guys want to see all the numbers behind this, those are all in the article. I break it down in painstaking detail, so you can check that out. Only other kind of thing I wanted to flag at wide receiver as a takeaway is, and I feel super responsible for this in a way, like in the industry, like the reason we're all so obsessed with it. We need to like chill with the year 2 breakout at the wide receiver position. It's not a thing, but when you zoom out and you look at, again, the ESPN league winner rate, the guys that are on over 55% of playoff teams over the past decade-ish, it is overwhelmingly guys that are in years 3, years 4, or years 5 of their career. It is very rarely the year 2 guys. So while there's often a big jump in production from year 1 to year 2, I think over the past couple of years, the industry has become like very, very aware of that. It is very much priced into a lot of these receivers' ADPs. We saw the year 2 bump very priced in with Ladd McConkey, with Brian Thomas Jr., even with like Marvin Harrison Jr., to some extent with Rome Odunze as well. Like all of these guys basically were being drafted way ahead of where their year 1 production was. And I don't want to make that mistake anymore. I don't want to like pay the premium for the breakout that hasn't happened yet for those year 2 guys, because the overall ceiling just demonstrably is not as high as the year 3 through year 5 guys. So just to share the numbers, this year, 5 out of the 6 league winning wide receivers were in years 3 through 5 of their careers. Since 2017, 23 of the 41 league-winning wide receivers were in that range, year 3 to year 5, 56% of them. That's just the wide receiver you should be drafting. That was the Jaxon Smith-Njigba year 3 breakout. That was the Amon-Ra St. Brown like peak production of his career. There are so many examples and so many guys. So yeah, I'm going to be like looking way harder at year 3, year 4, year 5 at the wide receiver position than year 2. I'll probably still write my my sophomore review for this wide receiver class, just because it's an interesting article to write at some point this spring or this summer. But yeah, that's just something I wanted to point out. We stopped being obsessed with the year 2 wide receiver. It's a couple years after that they usually are hitting these league winning outcomes.
All right, Ryan, you had a lot to say about wide receivers, but you know, we led this off talking about how running back is the most important position in fantasy. And I think you found something unique here. But yeah, let's talk about the running back position. What do you have for us, Ryan?
Yeah, so Scott, everything that you and I have been saying about running backs for the past several years kind of boils down to you want the elite running backs. They're the most valuable picks in fantasy, and you especially want the elite pass catching running backs because targets are so much more valuable than rush attempts, whether that's in PPR scoring and half PPR scoring and standard scoring. We've always been like team bell cow, draft the guys that get a lot of touches and catch a lot of passes. Those are who you want. And that has served us like pretty well. Christian McCaffrey, Devon Achane, both massive hits, kind of in that vein from this past season. But we have also kind of that has caused us sometimes, I would say, to miss out on the Jonathan Taylor types of seasons that Taylor just had. The last year, at least for me, the Derrick Henry owning me every single season, Saquon Barkley that one year, Nick Chubb in years past, like these types of elite rushers where I just have kind of always shied away from the, like, in the first few rounds, the elite runners that don't catch a lot of passes. That's always been like an archetype I'm not drawn to, and I know that's the case for like a lot of the more kind of analytical thinkers in the industry. But Jonathan Taylor finally broke me, I guess, is what I'm trying to say this year. So I was like, I'm gonna go back, look at the past 5 or so years, as far back as the Fantasy Points Data Suite goes, to 2021, and just look at the results by ADP for these different archetypes of running backs. So I did it by the percentage of XFP, so like their total workload that running backs got from the passing game. Kind of put them into buckets: non-pass catchers, like your kind of average pass catchers, and then like your elite pass catchers that are getting 40% or more of their XFP from the receiving game. That's your McCaffreys and your Achans. The like average guys, some examples are like Kyron Williams in certain years, like Dalvin Cook, like the guys that catch passes, but that's not like the biggest thing they do. It's not like the major feature of their profile. Those are the 3 buckets. And I just looked at how often each of these archetypes is massively beating their ADP. So I didn't do it by ESPN league winner rate. I went with an ADP based formula, how much they're getting 5 or more points over their ADP expectation per game. So that's all kind of complicated. I explained it in the article if people are curious about that process. But what I came to was, while yes, the elite pass catching running backs do very often exceed their ADP massively, turn into league winners, also the guys that don't catch passes at all do it at similar or better rates within the entire like first 100 picks of a fantasy draft over the past 5 years. Now, of course, this isn't every player. The rates are between like 16% and 30% to get these massive hits. But that was surprising to me, that the total non-pass catchers, the Nick Chubb, Derrick Henry archetype, were hitting so hard often enough that they're actually competing with these elite guys. And kind of the average guys in the middle were the ones with the worst hit rates. So that's interesting to me. And I would explain that by saying that I think it's a market thing to some extent. Like, as the fantasy industry has become more aware of the value of pass catching for running backs, I think we have also penalized the non-pass catchers way too harshly, just in terms of where we're willing to draft them by ADP. So that's something I'm going forward with, is I want to stay out of the middle at running back, and I want to really look hard when I'm figuring out, okay, which players am I going to be overweight on in a given season. I want to look really hard at the elite pass catchers, but also at the elite runners that are seen as not catching very many passes, that very often the market will just kind of leave for dead at the back end of the second round and the third and the fourth round. It's an archetype I'm going to be paying a lot of attention to. It comes with a couple really important caveats, which I also expand on more in the article, but you have to get these guys on good teams. This does not work if they are on the Cleveland Browns. Very clearly, there's like a very strong correlation for this archetype of runner where they're not catching passes between their team's win total and how much they're exceeding their ADP by. So to some extent, you're betting on their team to be really good as well. And there isn't any correlation for preseason win totals. So there's not like just a cheat code there. It's not like immediately, the Ravens are going to win 12 games, therefore I draft Derrick Henry. It'll work out sometimes, it won't in others. And also, this only starts to apply after you get to like the back half of round 2. If you just look inside the top 18 picks, there's an awful track record for the runners and the non-pass catchers. They're 0 for 7 at exceeding ADP by even a marginal amount since 2021. You've really got to wait until it's actually like, yes, the market is saying these guys are worse fantasy picks because they don't catch passes. I'm going to take advantage of it. Some of the worst busts have been when Saquon Barkley gets steamed up into the top 3 of ADP after the type of season he had in 2024. And then everything doesn't go right for the team, and he's a bust at a really early ADP. So I'd stay away from it like in the first round, but after that, I'm going to be a lot more interested in just like the ground and pound type of runner. So yeah, I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts on that, Scott. I just talked for a long time. So yeah, hit me with anything you have on this idea.
Yeah, this archetype of runner, an early down workhorse, a plotter, that's kind of what a non-bell cow. That's kind of what we refer to them. So whenever I missed on this, I would always say, well, I'm never going to get badly hurt because they don't have the upside, the league wrecking potential of a Christian McCaffrey, of a Jahmyr Gibbs, Bijan Robinson, Devon Achane. And I actually don't know how true that is just because of these last 2 years. So 2 years ago, Saquon Barkley, really not heavily involved as a pass catcher, was the most valuable player in fantasy. And then this past year, Jonathan Taylor was basically this year's Saquon Barkley. If Daniel Jones had stayed healthy, really could have just wrecked leagues. One of the craziest stats you can find, and this kind of points to one of the flaws of this archetype, which is that they're very game script sensitive. Here's the crazy stat. In wins, Jonathan Taylor averaged 31.5 fantasy points per game. In losses, he averaged 12.4. So basically, the most valuable running back in fantasy by like 8 points versus just like run-of-the-mill high-end RB3 in losses. And so we're very familiar with this, Ryan, because we play DFS. We get really excited about Jonathan Taylor in spots Indianapolis should dominate. But I'm looking at this and I wonder how true it actually is. Like, I get it. It's very upside wins championships. I feel like most times you're gonna miss on this archetype. But still, you can, at cost, you can hit in such a way that it's always worth the gamble. I wonder how much ADP plays a role. You did say you definitely don't want this in round one, certainly not early round two. And so you're talking about round two, round three. I really wonder how many of those hits are just the guys we know. It's just Nick Chubb, Derrick Henry, Jonathan Taylor, who are just like freak outliers where you could just, I know ball, like this guy is a sick runner. And I wonder how that changes things, if it's smart or not to just kind of remove them from the sample. But yeah, then when you're talking about round 5 through 10, I think it makes all the sense in the world. It's very rare to find a bell cow or a running back with bell cow upside who's not a pure handcuff where, the chances of him hitting are just totally out of your control. It's just, hey, hopefully this guy in front of him gets hurt. That's why, Cam Scatterbo was such a unique opportunity for us. And, it's such a shame he got hurt because he was the rare I see an every down bell cow who's great on the ground and through the air. But it's generally very rare to find anyone like that. And if there is someone like that, you just have a ton of warts where, actually they're just a pure handcuff and you're praying the guy in front of him gets hurt. And so you're left with what? You're left with, I don't know, like the vintage Jordan Howards of the world, where it's like, his ADP is depressed because, what's his upside? He doesn't catch passes. But, this market inefficiency is that, we're not thinking, hey, maybe the offensive line is better than we're giving it credit for. Maybe the defense is a lot better and this could actually be a 10-win team and he could fall into the end zone a couple of times. So I get that. I'm still left with kind of what I've said for a long time, which is, but like, he doesn't have bury you upside. And so how much does that matter? And yeah, so I think for me personally, I think this is interesting and something I'm going to keep in the back of my mind, but I still think it's very micro, it depends on the player. It depends on the team. What do you think? I don't know if I just countered it or agreed with you.
It super depends on the player and on the team. And I'm not even necessarily saying that in 2026, I'm going to look at the ADP and say, oh, I know I'm going to identify one or two of these guys that I'm going to tout really hard. Like it may not be the case that it plays out like this in 2026. But I do think there's more of a wide range of players that can kind of hit in this way than you're maybe giving it credit for. I can just read off the names. So these are all the running backs that have hit 5 or more fantasy points per game over expectation since 2022 that were drafted in the top 100.
All right, real quick, just with your methodology though, what have I always said in, Upside Wins Championships is like, what is a high-end fantasy RB3, a low-end fantasy RB2 worth? Basically nothing. So like this very well could be where you had like a round 18 pick who, returned low-end RB2 value. And it's like, it's not really, I wouldn't classify that as a hit, but go on. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah. So this is only inside the top 100 of ADP. All these names I'm about to list off averaged at least 15 fantasy points per game. So at least they were very useful pieces, right? So Jonathan Taylor this past season, 2025, of course, plus 7.9 over expectation. James Cook this past year, 5.9. Isaiah Pacheco in 2023 was drafted at 77 overall, averaged 15.4 fantasy points per game. Not like a huge, he won me my league, but that's like a genuine hit. That's a high-end RB2 you got pretty late that is going to help out. David Montgomery in 2024, of course, that's like the Lions steamrolling everyone. He's scoring all these touchdowns. Went pretty late, 66 ADP. James Conner in 2024, again, so not massive league winner, but like very useful piece that got drafted pretty late, 16 fantasy points per game. Ken Walker in 2024, because if you remember the year before, he barely caught any passes. That one maybe has an asterisk. We got onto that one in the summer that he was going to be targeted more often in 2024 in that new offensive scheme. Ramondre Stevenson in 2022, and then Derrick Henry in 2024. So yeah, only like 3 or 4 guys that are like, oh man, those were like huge hits that like were single-handedly like carrying you to the playoffs. But that's a lot of like really positive outcomes kind of up and down the draft board in the top 100 of players that the year before were barely involved in their passing games. So it's very much like an ADP and a market thing. But it's something I'm going to be attuned to this year is more what I'm saying.
Yeah, good call. I think you're right. And good methodology there. Yeah. And I think part of it is like, is this running back on a team that's probably going to be top 5 in scoring? Like that's big. Like, Ben Johnson, Lions, Josh Allen, Bills, Saquon Barkley with the Eagles, Jonathan Taylor this past year. So I think that's something we can use to help us identify these players who would otherwise be ADP outliers. All right, let's move over to the quarterback and tight end positions. I think we can hit this fairly quickly and then wrap up today's show. What have you got for us on quarterbacks?
Yeah, so the biggest thing at quarterback is that the kind of elite high-end quarterbacks were mostly a disappointment this year. Quarterback scoring at the top end overall was down. This is very obviously and easily attributable just to Lamar Jackson and Jaden Daniels, like 2 of the consensus top 4 like hypermobile quarterbacks having hamstring injuries. And that obviously that brings down all of their rushing stats. For Lamar specifically, it really affected him even inside the pocket. Fantasy Points Data tweeted this out a couple days ago, but he went from one of the best quarterbacks by every accuracy efficiency metric to like a fringe top 30 quarterback by passer rating, accurate throw rate in the pocket after his hamstring injury. And part of that is like defenses can play Lamar Jackson differently when there isn't as much of a threat of him taking off. There's like a million ways you can go with that, but yeah, I think overall it's the elite guys got hurt. Probably the biggest lesson is like all it takes is a hamstring pull for some of these guys to suddenly not be elite fantasy quarterbacks. Like even if they are going to play out the season, even if like hypermobile quarterbacks aren't actually more injury prone, which was something Edwin Porras did a study on years ago and is always citing. I think it is fair to say that maybe some of them are more prone to like playing through injury or their production coming down with like these minor lower body injuries than like a pocket passer, a Dak Prescott or somebody might be. So that's like one takeaway I had. The other big takeaway really is we just should have never messed around with these elite quarterbacks, because it seems like we've just figured out late round quarterback between the two of us. It's like very easily repeatable, seemingly every year, the way to get production from the quarterback position in the late rounds and just get 90 to 100% of like what a Josh Allen is going to do. You either go with the Konami code, the year 2 bump for quarterbacks. We saw that in vogue with Drake May this year. Or you go with this McVay, Shanahan, McShanahan play calling tree cheat code that we've observed over the past 5 or more seasons. Doing the same FPG over expectation methodology since 2021. 5 of the top 7 late round QB seasons have come from a McVay or a Shanahan tree play caller. Just added Matthew Stafford, Brock Purdy by points per game, and Trevor Lawrence to that list this year. The percentages are like very different between McShanahan and non-McShanahan QBs in terms of hitting at these big rates. It's like 22% to hit 5 or more FPG over expectation, 6.5% for non-McShanahan QBs. This coming year, we will be looking at Justin Herbert, Baker Mayfield, whoever the Cardinals start, and then whoever the Raiders start, assumedly Mendoza, as kind of like the new McShanahan system QBs. So that's like really just the biggest takeaway is I feel like we have so many ins at late round quarterback that I would almost always rather, in most leagues, I think, for when I'm giving advice to most subscribers, just don't mess around with the early quarterback. Take the extra shot at the positions that are honestly harder to hit at, like the running back, the wide receiver position in round 3 and round 4. I feel like we are just always going to find at least 1 or 2 late guys that we really like and that are going to work out.
Yeah, so I want to touch on both points you brought up. First, the hypermobile quarterback suffering injuries. This is something, by the way, Joe Burrow also was a top 5 quarterback by ADP who his season was derailed by injury. He came back, but I don't know that he was close to 100%. And so Theo, very boldly, ranked him much lower than consensus in his dynasty rankings. Why? Because the risk of him suffering yet another injury. But back to Lamar and Jaden Daniels, this is something John Hansen always talks about, where, I'm obsessed with the Konami code quarterbacks because it's such a cheat code, but John thinks, that's negated somewhat by the heightened injury risk. I still kind of disagree with that, but, I certainly get his point. And I will say maybe my worst take all year was not in my draft guide. It was in the everything report, where I was just continually beating the drum like, hey, Lamar's missed the last 3 weeks. Trade. He's a great buy low. Trade for him, add him to your team, because I was like, well, he's going to get healthy at some point, and this Baltimore defense is the worst we've ever seen it. So like, I expect it to be the Lamar show where he runs like crazy and blah blah blah. And no, he was just never healthy. And like, this is, something we've talked about before. I should have seen this coming. Is Lamar Jackson with a leg injury is like a bottom 5 quarterback in the NFL. Like the whole reason why he's Lamar Jackson is the strain he puts on a defense is how they have to play him differently, because they have to account for his legs. And when you don't have to do that, you can treat him as just a pure pocket passer. He's not good at that. There's maybe 30 plus quarterbacks who are better at being a pocket passer than Lamar Jackson. But anyway, that was a mistake. That was something I'm thinking about. And I think you nail it with late round quarterback. Guys, late round quarterback is king. In a vacuum, if you want to look at Josh Allen, you can make the case for him as a great second round pick where it's 6 years in a row he's finished first or second in fantasy points per game. He is as dependable as they come. That's a real potent edge, is, outscoring all other quarterbacks by 4+ fantasy points per game. The biggest argument against him is just how every year there's multiple quarterbacks with double-digit round ADPs who come within 85, 90% of him in fantasy points per game. And it's not just that these quarterbacks exist, but it's that they're very easy to find. Look at the Exodia quarterback track record. Like, it has not missed. I've gotten lucky. I've gotten very lucky there, but it's like 6 years of like perfectly nailing the late round quarterback. And like, we're going to do it again this year. And like 2026, it was Drake Maye. I thought he was going to run more. He didn't even need to run. He was MVP runner up. So again, maybe I got lucky, but it's also like, who were the Exodia runner ups? It was, Justin Herbert, who, might have won MVP if his offensive line stayed healthy. It was Dak Prescott, he looked great. Even like my least favorite quarterback ever, Trevor Lawrence, was such a fantasy juggernaut. Matthew Stafford, it was just totally dead. You could have picked him up off of waivers week 3. And so, it's don't fall for that trap. Hopefully Jackson Dart is going to be cheap this year and he'll be the 2026 Exodia. But it's just, ADP is bad at the quarterback position. So let's take advantage of it. Let's not waste valuable draft capital on a onesie position that just doesn't move the needle in the same way as running backs or wide receivers. But Ryan, what about the tight end position? This was, you and I both like to self-flagellate and, own our mistakes in an attempt to learn from them. And this is the one you seem to give yourself the most grief over.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe that's because I wrote an entire article in the offseason about why you shouldn't draft Trey McBride or Brock Bowers or any elite tight end, because elite tight ends are fake in a post-Travis Kelce world. And McBride turned around and did the exact thing that I thought he never could do. 18.6 fantasy points per game, second most in fantasy points data history. He had the Travis Kelce level season. He was a league winner. He was more than worth a round 2 or a round 3 pick. This one, like, obviously I got the micro player take wrong. I would argue that that's partially because Kyler Murray got soft benched. McBride's end zone targets per game went up by like 5x when he went from Kyler to Brissett. The Cardinals were on pace for the most dropbacks per game in fantasy points data history. McBride led the NFL in garbage time targets, trailing by multiple scores in the fourth quarter. None of this is like real NFL football in the sense that I think the Cardinals are going to try to repeat it and replicate that season they just had very clearly with their coaching moves, firing their coaching staff and everything. But I was wrong about McBride in particular. In practice, that's egg on my face. But I'm going to stand by the idea that you shouldn't be drafting tight ends early for the quote-unquote positional advantage, because that's just not really a thing in most league settings, like default lineup settings. If there's 3 wide receivers and a flex or whatever, you need the tight end to score as a wide receiver 1 for him to be worth drafting early. McBride did. I don't think that a lot of people who drafted McBride really had that in their minds. Maybe they got bailed out. Maybe I'm just super bitter right now. But that's where I'm at. I stand by the anti-elite tight end process. I'm still only drafting them going forward if I think they can have that type of special season. But that's where I'm at. It was a rough one to watch down the stretch of the year. It was Trey McBride owning me every single week, but we learn, we move on, and we don't just over adjust to, oh my God, I have to draft McBride next year. That whole team is going to look very different I think he will be more expensive. I doubt I'm in on Trey McBride in 2026 unless the ADP is somehow lower, which feels impossible.
All right. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed today's episode. We haven't yet touched on my biggest lesson learned, my biggest takeaway of the 2025 season. What do I always say? The micro is the macro. So I think everyone's going to love our next episode where we dive in deep on the specific players. Who are my Exodia plays? Which of those were hits? Which of those were misses? What were the key lessons learned? So be on the lookout for that. And thank you for tuning in to today's episode.